This talk about Iran and the nuclear endgame, what are the odds of peace? You know, it's an important topic. I didn't choose the title, and I wish I had, in the sense that it's a great title, and I appreciate it. I don't think I can live up to it, unfortunately. Like I read the description. I said, this is going to be a great talk. So I will try to live up to it. The problem, the core problem is, for me, what are the odds of peace? Well, I will try to answer that question at the end. But constitutionally, my belief about the world, the way I am, I don't feel like we're very good at predicting the future. I don't think I'm very good at predicting the future. People who are good at predicting the future, I don't know, they should go to Vegas. So I can't really tell you what are the odds of peace. What I can tell you is something about why we are where we are and why we're on the trajectory that we're on and why we might believe that this current trajectory would persist. So I can tell you about interests of different countries. I can tell you about the activities of different countries and what we might reason is an outcome from, or maybe a most likely outcome from different choices that countries make. But it's very hard to then get from that to say with much confidence, and here's what I think is gonna happen, right? So, I mean, that's kind of the caution. Like, this is what everyone would really like to know. They like to know a few things more than that. But I think the most I can do is help frame the question for you and give you some information. And then, you know, everyone makes their own judgments, I think, about what they think might happen and how much, well, in this business, how scared they are of that thing that might happen, right? Because when you decide, you know, how afraid you are, that might guide what you think policy choices should be. So I'm going to try to make briefly 3 key points I want to leave you with that, you know, will hopefully build from the remarks. The first thing is, I think we all should just understand this is not Iran acting irrationally. This is not Iran crazy aggressive people. This is not Iran unusual in history or in the present. Iran has reason why it makes sense from their perspective, why you could imagine they would want a nuclear weapon, right? And they probably don't want to tell the world that they want a nuclear weapon. So even if they're working on it, they're going to say, no, 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 we just want nuclear power and nuclear technology. And in fact, there might be reason they would want that too, right? It's not, you know, the fact that they have quite a lot of oil is not a reason why they wouldn't also want nuclear power generation for electricity in principle. They could sell the oil and, you know, generate power with nuclear. So, things make sense, what they're doing. The things that don't make, there are things about what Iran is doing currently that don't make sense, that lead you to believe that they're dissembling when they say they're not trying to build a nuclear weapon, right? But I can understand, and I think they're likely to, you know, since I think most of the time countries do what's in their interest, I think they will try to get a nuclear weapon. From our perspective, the nuclear endgame has to do with the United States and other countries, how they react to Iran trying to get a nuclear weapon. And influencing other countries is hard. Most of the tools we have are very weak for influencing other countries. Diplomacy, sweet talking them, saying, you know, it would much be better, we can all get along. It doesn't work that often. It's hard to convince people, to talk people out of doing what is in their interest to do just with words. Economic tools, we'll talk more about economic sanctions because that's been a primary tool that the world has used with respect to Iran's nuclear program. Economic sanctions turn out to be a feeble tool too. They work sometimes, but you have to try really hard. You have to put a lot of effort into getting not that much impact. And on major decisions that confront countries, things that they care a lot about, economic sanctions are generally too small to tip the balance compared to a big decision that another country would make. So given that, you have to set your expectations carefully on how you can affect what other countries will do. Obviously, there's that third step, which I'll talk about too. We have diplomacy, you've got your economic statecraft tools, and then you have military force. And military force also, again, I'll talk more about this, is it's good at achieving some things and not good at achieving other things, right? So it's a limited tool. The last thing is Iranian nuclear weapons, if they get them, will matter, right? Things will be different if Iran has nuclear weapons. But you have to ask yourself how different. How much do you care? And part of that depends on who you are and where you are. But Iran getting nuclear weapons is not in our interest, but it's probably not, people like to use the phrase of vital national interest to the United States, right? Might be, not sure. So you have to compare the level of interest that we have to the level of effectiveness of the tools that we have at our disposal, right? And if you think the tools aren't that effective, you might try to use them anyway if you cared a lot. But if you don't care, if you care but not a lot, you might have reason not to, to opt for a more peaceful rather than more violent nuclear endgame. Okay, so those are the three things that I think you might want to take away. The first little bit, I think, sets the stage. It's probably things we're all more or less familiar with, so I don't think I'll spend a terribly long time. But, Iran, it's in an interesting neighborhood, I guess we'll say. There's a lot of oil there, which generates some potential wealth. It has a number of neighbors that, frankly, don't like Iran very much. So it lives, from its perspective, in a tough neighborhood. There are quite a few fault lines, ethnic, religious. There's a whole set of different things that make it somewhat volatile. Picture is just a map with of petroleum sector facilities in Iran. And in another part of my life, as Charles said, I spent a fair amount of time thinking about energy issues, and so this was convenient. But for today, the key Iran overview points to take away are the politics. Iran calls itself a revolutionary state and is a revolutionary state. They have ambitious goals. They would love to change the world in many ways. And this is not a strange and unique feature of the cabal of 6 guys that run the Iranian government. This is fairly widespread in the political class in Iran, right? So even the opposition, they may think you should have reforms within Iranian society. They may think you should, loosen up some of the cultural strictures or not. They may believe in changing economic policies in Iran, but there is not a major political force that doesn't think Iran is a unique and important country, that doesn't think that Iran should have an appropriate role, of leadership in the politics of the region, that doesn't think Iran is a more powerful state than it's given credit for internationally. There's just widespread agreement. Now, there are probably differences in the details, and I don't know them, and I would be skeptical of anyone who told you they did know them, right? Reading the tea leaves and details of politics in any country is very hard, especially in other countries where you don't know what is rhetorical and said for effect and what is real. You don't know the background, or you don't understand words the same way as they're being said. To us, the salience of political events, what's an important political event, something that happened last week, my impression, watching this closely from afar, but not being a deep Iran person in the sense of domestic politics, my sense is that 1953 seems very relevant and salient to many people in Iran in a way that it's not in the United States, right? When the United States participated in a coup to bring the Shah back, right? That profoundly changes the attitude and the perspective that many people in Iran have about the relationship with the rest of the world, right? It makes them very suspicious, things that would be long forgotten in our political culture. So trying to figure out what the details are, I don't think you should put much stake in hopes for this particular figure to rise or that political figure to fall. It's just too complicated. The other thing is, let's talk about the economy for a second, because economic sanctions have been such an important part of the relationship between the rest of the world and Iran, especially recently. It's basically a non-market economy. There are, of course, markets. You can go out in the bazaar, and there's vibrant markets, lots of products available. People haggle for them, or whatever they, however they purchase. But the large sweep of the economy is very dominated by state institutions or special nonprofit institutions. It's a planned economy in a very serious way. And the government, of course, lives off the oil revenue, right? So tax revenue is quite low compared to other countries in Iran. They just don't, it's the money goes originally to the government, and the government decides how to spend it from the oil business, as opposed to going to private citizens who then the government has to collect the money from through taxes, which changes the political relationship between the government and the people, right? The people never touch the money that goes to the government. Iran, we also think it's a fairly modern country in some ways, set back by many years of sanctions and bad economic management, but 25% of the labor force is in agriculture, right? That's like the United States in the 1930s, agriculture-wise, right? It just hasn't had that huge shift, and it's not very efficient agriculture. Iran imports a lot of food, right? It didn't used to be the case, but it does. So that's a relevant thing. And the last thing I'll mention, the Boniads and the Revolutionary Guard, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, are very active in the economy. So the Boniads are these special nonprofit institutions. They're very hard to understand. They own businesses. They don't have any public accounts. You can't track the flow of funds. So it makes it hard to understand. All of these characteristics of the economy make it hard to understand the impact of sanctions. Where the pain is going to be felt by different sanctions that are imposed on the Iranian economy. It's just hard to track. Like, we thought we had a model of the German economy in World War II when we tried to break the economy with strategic bombing. Our model was terrible, and we did a bad job. We didn't understand the effects of our attacks on the German economy. But the German economy was somewhat transparent compared to the Iranian economy, right? It's very complicated. Okay, so what I was saying about Iran, I understand why they might want a nuclear weapon. Their strategic situation, not so good. So they don't get along with many of their neighbors. They have few allies, maybe getting fewer all the time, depending what you think is going to happen in Syria. And Syria is clearly right now a net dependency, not a net supporter, if you're from the Iranian strategic perspective. So if they get in trouble, they can't expect the cavalry to come. Right? They've got to be their own cavalry, right? And if you're going to be your own cavalry, that might make nuclear weapons attractive. They have a military that, this picture is of an anti-ship cruise missile, a mobile land-based anti-ship cruise missile. The Iranians have gotten something of a reputation for having a bunch of these with which they saber rattle in the Strait of Hormuz periodically. They threaten to disrupt international oil shipping. One of these was given to Hezbollah and used, well, several of them actually were used in Lebanon. They sunk an Egyptian freighter, and which was probably an accident on their part because they were trying to hit Israeli ships. But in any event, these weapons are useful for some things, but they're not really what Iran wants. Iran doesn't have the military forces to confront a serious military opponent in a head-to-head way. They have a strategy that they've pursued for, since the end of the Iran-Iraq War, of asymmetric military operations. They prepare to fight in hit-and-run kinds of ways, in ways that create disproportionate political effect. They like image more than underlying capability. So actually, we'll have another picture in a little while that's typical of this, but the Iranian military actually can be quite good at pulling off special operations stunts sometimes, right? But they're kind of stunts. They're things that look, their goal is to make a big splash because they can't, follow it up with a lot of combat power, a lot of punch. And so even in a head-to-head fight, with a developed military, they would have great difficulty, but even in a head-to-head fight with the Gulf states, with the Sunni states in the Gulf, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Oman and whatever, the Iranians, even though they've got a much bigger population and a fair amount of money, they would be in a tough fight. Right? The technology is better, the training is better, there's a whole bunch of things that are not on Iran's side, right? So if they're scared, they need a trump card. And nuclear weapons are just the kind of trump card that they seem to tend to find attractive. It's something splashy. It's something that's seems high-end. They like to fire off, missile tests and say, hey, look, we've got capability. And the last thing is, if you were in Iran's position, you would be scared of the United States. The United States has mucked around in your country for a long time. You remember 1953. You didn't like the 70s so much if you're in the government. And have bases all around Iran. There's just a picture of some of them got there for reasons that had nothing to do with Iran, to us, right? And we've pulled back out of Iraq. That's good from Iran's perspective, right? But we still have quite a lot of combat power in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in UAE and Oman. So, and then of course in Afghanistan. So on both sides of their country. So it looks like we're up close and personal. So here's one of these pictures that I mentioned where they like spectacle. So this is actually from a couple years ago when they first started enriching uranium. Sure, they're enriching uranium, but very few countries hold, when they are celebrating a military achievement, a traditional dance program of people to display it. I mean, I'm sure it was lovely, doves of peace and all of these things, but that is, yes, they're celebrating a real achievement, but they celebrate it in a way to attract attention. It's kind of what they want to do. But this is the kind of the bottom line on the Iranian program. They are enriching uranium. This is what people are unhappy about. If you enrich uranium to a quite high level, 93%, something like that, of the right isotope of uranium through this technical process. I'm happy to talk about it if you guys want, but it seems fairly technical. But if you get it to that, you can make bombs out of the uranium. If you enrich to a much lower extent, you can power nuclear reactors. And Iran has this somewhat unusual situation where they have a research reactor that uses relatively highly enriched uranium compared to most power generation reactors, but it's way less enriched than you would use to make a bomb, right? So basically you can't make a bomb out of 20% enriched uranium, which is what the Iranians are enriching to, and they say it's related to their research reactor, and that's kind of where they stand. But the problem is the process that lets you get it to 20% is the same as the process that lets you get it to 93%, minus a few little tweaks, right? But it's the same basic thing. You put it in one of these devices or a cascade of these devices that I have pictures of up here, or schematics of, that are centrifuges. So they spin it around really fast, and the two different isotopes of uranium weigh different amounts or have different masses. And so you can separate them. One of them goes to the outside and the other one stays toward the inside of the centrifuge, and that allows you to get to concentrate the right isotope for nuclear power or an uncontrolled nuclear reaction for a bomb. And so they are currently making progress. They're enriching to 20%. They have quite a lot of centrifuges operating. It actually takes a whole lot of centrifuges all in a row in order to make a bomb, right? Or in order to get to 93%, or frankly, to get to 20%, right? You talk about a cascade of centrifuges. So you use thousands of centrifuges all in the same facility, wired, not wired up, piped one to the other, where each one gets the uranium a little more concentrated until at the end of what they call the cascade, you get out uranium that's good enough for your reactor or potentially good enough for a bomb. So they're expanding, they're bringing more and more centrifuges online. Their centrifuges aren't that good, neither is their feedstock, right? They've had a series of technical problems. Part of these may have to do with just, everyone understands the technology, but it's hard to do in practice. There's some art here, not just science. Part of their problems may be people encourage them to have problems, right? There are stories about covert action or more about intentionally allowing them to have essentially non-functional plans, right? They get their stuff through complicated smuggling networks, and if you can inject low-quality stuff into the smuggling network, then their system won't work right? So they have a set of problems, a set of hurdles. But one of the other things is we've discovered they now have 2 sites for enrichment. Everyone has been concerned for years about this, building it in Natanz, which is quite large. It's also, relatively insecure. If you were trying to have a military strike, one could imagine hitting Natanz much more easily than this new site at Fordow, which is essentially underground, essentially under a mountain. Right? I'll show you a satellite picture in a minute, but they are making progress on getting better at enrichment, and they're finding ways to prepare, to make it harder for other people to disrupt their enrichment. So, what are people doing about this? They want a bomb, or they have reason to want a bomb, we all suspect. They say their program is not bomb-directed, but I guess one other thing, I didn't put this on the slide, but most of what they're doing in their program under the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, would be legal, right? They're allowed to enrich, they're allowed to have certain sites which are designated to the IAEA under the treaty, they're not breaking any rules, except that Iran, in setting up these sites, finds ways to break rules, right? And that's what makes people convinced there's something fishy here. Right? So they don't disclose sites that they're supposed to disclose. They don't let inspectors come to sites that inspectors are supposed to be able to go to. They do a whole bunch of things. Iran should be able, through international law, to enrich uranium. But they have to do it through a certain mechanism, and they're not doing that. Right? They're doing something they could do legally, but in an illegal way. Makes you think. Right, raises questions. So where are we with the sanctions as a result of this? So there are really 2 important kinds of sanctions, right? And I'm going to argue, I'm going to try to convince you, what did I just do? No, I meant this. I'm going to try to convince you that this is more important and a better idea than this. Right? So we go to great lengths to deny specific technology, make it illegal to sell. It's actually against UN sanctions as well, not just US, to sell specific technologies that are dual-use technologies or technologies that are dedicated to nuclear programs to Iran. Right? So it just makes it harder because they don't have domestic sources, particularly of some of the kind of high-end materials and components that you need for your nuclear program. So fancy steels called merging steels, which are very hard, they don't produce domestically, right? And so we don't let them buy merging steels. Or advanced carbon fibers that you need in those centrifuges that I showed you. They, with great fanfare, have said we're developing a carbon fiber industry. They've opened a plant, but people who've looked at the carbon fibers say these are actually quite low quality. They're very primitive. I mean, yes, they're working on carbon fibers, but it's nowhere close to what they need. And in fact, the Iranians keep going out into the international market and through front companies, through smuggling activities, all of these different things. It's very clear that they're trying to get carbon fibers, right? So, because they would like them, and of course they would say, oh, we want these for, I don't know, I'm making this up now, but the details, right? But they say, oh, we want them for bulletproof vests, right? This is not about nuclear weapons, right? But it's about nuclear weapons, right? And they're trying to get their hands on these particular technologies. But so this doesn't permanently prevent them from getting stuff. Like, they have working centrifuges. They've stolen stuff, they've smuggled stuff, they've, reverse engineered at lower quality but gotten it to kind of work. They've gotten a whole bunch of equipment. So they're making progress slowly. But the progress is wildly slower than it would be if this were just an open, you can buy what you need global market, right? This is quite effective at slowing down the Iranian program, right? The other kind of economic sanctions have nothing to do with the details of nuclear weapons, right? This is a deal a proposal we've made to the Iranians. We've said, you're doing something we don't like. You're engaging in what we consider bad behavior. We're going to hurt you until you stop, right? We will stop hurting you when you stop the bad behavior. So we've offered them a contingent deal, right? It's disciplining your kids, something like that. And that's not nice to say about other countries, right? They believe they have sovereignty and all of these kinds of things. They're not kids. But it's the same kind of logic. If you do this, bad thing will happen. If you behave, we'll be nice to you. And this is working now in a way that it didn't for many years. It's hard to hurt another economy. They can find, if the United States cuts off trade with a country, they can trade with somebody else. They can find Europeans who want to trade with them, or Chinese who want to trade with them, or they can trade with their neighbors, all of these different alternatives. Like, the market is very vibrant. People don't just quit when you say, I don't want to play with you anymore, right? If you take the bat and ball, they'll go find another bat and ball and they'll play baseball without you, or whatever it is, use the analogy of your choice. So what's happened lately, though, the Europeans really have changed their view. They're cooperating much more with sanctions. They've put much stronger sanctions on in the past couple of years. The United States has changed our rules about sanctions so that we not only sanction American firms, we say you guys can't do business with Iran, right? But we sanction other countries, companies that are headquartered in other countries that maybe they have an affiliate that does business with Iran, but we'll sanction their American affiliate, or we'll sanction their ability to get funds from American banks, right? So even countries or companies that are very tangentially related to the United States are now subject to American sanctions to prevent them from doing business with Iran. And this has really changed the behavior of a lot of companies who otherwise were doing business with Iran. And then the last thing, this is brand new. We've, in the last month, started to, so Iran was having trouble getting access to dollars, and dollars, of course, matter a lot in the oil market, since oil in general is priced in dollars, right? So we wouldn't let them trade with dollars. They're having trouble selling stuff. They had elaborate ways that they were essentially bartering, and mostly they were bartering for gold, right? And so we've ratcheted up our sanctions to say, actually now you can get sanctions not just if you transfer dollars to Iran, but also if you transfer gold to Iran. And so this is a picture of a Turkish bank, right? Turkey, not a big gold producer, but in the past couple years, they became a quite large gold net exporter, right? Because they were using gold to pay for gas from Iran, and they had fairly robust trade. And this bank in particular, and some others, now are basically out of that business this month. So, it's getting harder and harder to engage in normal trade. These sanctions are getting quite serious against Iran. And you can just see that in 2012, last year, Iran's oil exports are way focused on the Far East. So China is the biggest, but a lot to Japan, a lot to South Korea, some to India, and then they have this gas trade with Turkey, right? All of them are coming down substantially. But last year, a 40% drop in exports to Iran, from Iran to Japan. So the US gives a national security waiver to our sanctions to allow Japan to continue to import some oil from Iran, but it's much less. So the Iranians are hemorrhaging money. And you can also see that because they used to have this huge pile of foreign exchange reserves, like a pile of dollars that they'd built up over the years by selling oil. And last year, they spent something like 40% of their foreign exchange reserves, so funding excess imports that they couldn't pay for with exports because the sanctions were starting to bite, right? So the economy is in trouble, and one of the big effects of this is there's serious hyperinflation. It's the first time there's hyperinflation in the Middle East, right? There's hyperinflation. We think about Latin America. We think about Weimar Germany. But now, prices are doubling every 6 weeks or something. And why is that? It's because imports are restricted, right? There's just the inflation, right, if you think about the price of goods in a country, it's just the amount of money you have in that country chasing the number of goods you have, right? So you divide the total money supply by the total number of goods and you get a price index, right? Well, so what's happened in Iran? The total number of goods is smaller and the total amount of money sloshing around is still quite big. In fact, it's getting bigger because the government keeps printing money, right? So you have more money chasing fewer and fewer goods, prices going through the roof. This is incredibly disruptive, right? It makes it very hard to live your life when inflation is at this level. The people are suffering from this, right? So the sanctions are working in that sense. They're just not working to achieve political change. So the other thing that's going on, I told you I'd show you a picture of this, a satellite picture of this plant at Fordow. So this is the under the mountain plant where they're now enriching uranium from a satellite. And in addition to the sanctions, people are doing other things. Don't know who, no one's claiming credit or responsibility, but it is true that in the last 2 years, 4 key scientists and engineers that are somehow connected to the Iranian nuclear program have been killed, right? One of them was shot, 3 of them were killed with bombs, right? So that almost certainly slows down the program, makes it harder, scares people, makes it harder for them to do their work. There have been explosions at key facilities. This slide actually comes from the markings on it are things connected to, allegedly there was an explosion at this facility in January that people suspected was another sabotage event. And basically the people at ISIS, which is a quite reputable think tank in Washington that bought this satellite image and labeled it, they don't believe that there was actually an incident in January. They say they can't find evidence from it in the satellite imagery. But it fits a pattern where there have been explosions at other Iranian facilities. So even if this one in January didn't happen, maybe it's that they have low quality stuff, like they have unstable equipment sitting around because they're buying it, they're using imperfect domestic substitutes or they're stealing it on the international market or whatever. So maybe they just have too many industrial accidents. But at a certain point, the pattern of industrial accidents makes you think somebody's actually trying to blow stuff up, right? Giving them trouble. And then the last thing, of course, is the celebrated Stuxnet cyber attack, which was all over the newspapers. And we can talk more about the details of Stuxnet. Stuxnet was really interesting as a cyber attack. It was designed not to infect computers like you have at your house, but the particular software that's an industrial control software that controls machinery in factories. And it was targeted very specifically to identify the kind of machinery that's used in the enrichment plants, right? But the impact, what Stuxnet did once it took control of those machines, was not that damaging, right? And there are different interpretations of why it might have been, but it doesn't seem like Stuxnet was intended, it was not intended to cause a catastrophic immediate failure. It wasn't meant to cause an explosion. It was meant to cause long-term disruption. It was maybe meant to collect data and information. But the fact that Stuxnet was there and was very sophisticated and did penetrate does suggest, there are some covert options that people are exploring to undermine the Iranian program. But I should say, nevertheless, the Iranian program is making progress, right? Even in the face of this, it's slow, but they're making progress, which is why people think, oh, we should do an airstrike. Can't we just end this all in one afternoon or evening? And, it's interesting, right? Like traditionally when you go and bomb places, you want to do it, you're trying to destroy an installation. If you're the United States and you're a nice country, you do it at night. Now you do it at night partially because you think it's safer for your planes, but this is the United States. We're not going to have trouble with the Iranian Air Force. You do it at night because nobody works there, right? You're trying to be nice. But in this case, actually, one of your goals is to get rid of the people who know what they're doing. Right? This is kind of the bloodthirsty aspect of the talk, right? Like, if you're in the business of trying to really hurt their program, actually, you don't want to break the machines that much Breaking the machines is good. It slows them down more because it's hard for them to get new machines. But what you really want to do is you want to get rid of the people who understand the art, who have got the machines working, right? And that's really not nice. But that's what we're talking about if we're talking about a military strike. You're trying to really set back the program. You can't do it because people know how to make this equipment. This equipment is not new. It's not super technologically sophisticated. It is a little hard to get because you need those complicated materials, right? You need precision machining. But, you know, if we did the bombing, we could destroy some of the machinery that's there now, and they could build some more machinery or buy some more or steal some more, right? And so the people who talk about the bombing, I have a good friend, he actually is next door to me at UT Austin, who's a prominent advocate of bombing, right? So he wrote a prominent New York Times op-ed saying we should bomb Iran's nuclear program, so Alan Cooperman. He talks about this as like mowing the grass, right? It's not, again, it's a blunt analogy, right? But it doesn't stop you from mowing the grass that you know it'll grow back. You're just gonna mow it again, right? And after a while, as you keep doing it, the good news with the nuclear program is they might learn and not go back to the nuclear program, right? The grass is never gonna learn. They're still gonna have to keep mowing it, right? But if you make it clear that you're never gonna get to bring this to fruition, that might stop them. But, so this is what people have in mind, I'll say, when they're advocating the bombing. So this is another old satellite image and of Iraq's Osirak plant, which Israel bombed in 1981. And this is what it looked like post-bombing, right? So people think this will be an easy task, right? The Israelis set back the Iraqi program by some amount. Not clear exactly how much. There's debate about that by bombing it. Now, partly what they bombed was a nuclear reactor, right? This is the reactor stuff. This is the centrifuge plant that was next to the reactor. Now, the centrifuges are what we're talking about bombing in Iran, different from the reactor. So the Iraqi program, allegedly, was to enrich uranium, put it in a nuclear reactor, get the spent fuel, reprocess it to separate out plutonium and build a plutonium bomb, right? The Iranian program is not a plutonium bomb program. It's to directly enrich the uranium to a high enough level so that you don't even need the nuclear reactor, right? All you need is enrichment. And that's in a way unfortunate because it turns out it's easier to destroy and prevent people from rebuilding a nuclear reactor when they're gonna go into the plutonium bomb route than it is to destroy and keep damaged centrifuge facilities, right? So the people learned, one of the things that happened is people learned from the Iraqi experience, and so now they use a different path to proliferating a bomb that's harder to hit through airstrikes. And the other thing, of course, they do is they tunnel, right? So we're good at destroying fixed targets, so we might have some success, but they've made it hard for us. Right? So it's a cat and mouse game like everything else. So where does that leave us? We've got a difficult mission and one that's not very permanent if we want to strike. All the things we're currently doing, the sanctions, make it harder and slow them down, or the covert operations, make it harder and slow down the Iranian program, yet they still make progress. Right? And so now the question is, what's the marginal benefit of upping the ante for our effort? We're already doing a lot. We could up the ante a bit more to do even more to try to limit their program, to slow it down further. But you can't stop the program, right? You can slow it down. You could repeatedly slow it down at some significant additional increment of cost. So you have to compare that to how much is it worth to you. And so this is a fairly simple and clear slide, I think. I think, you know, Iran is hostile to the United States. The leaders say it all the time. They say, you've been mean to us, we want to be mean to you. We're scared of you. We think you don't give us enough prestige and credit in our part of the world, right? They saber rattle a lot. They clamor against us. A lot of it is for show. A lot of it is like that dance performance, right? They try to give an image. And underlying it, they're mischievous, they're a pain in the neck, they're not nice, right? But they're hostile to the United States. I think it's unwise to bet on specific changes in Iranian politics. We don't know how likely these changes are. They may not come to pass. The new guys that come in, actually almost all of the opposition figures that have said something in public about the nuclear program always say they like it. Right? There is no opposition figure in Iran that says they don't want to continue the nuclear program, and they all say they want to continue it for energy reasons, of course, not for bombs. But I don't think we should bet on, even given the crippling economic sanctions, that this country is going to change its mind and do something that they view as against their fundamental national interest. From Iran's perspective, there's a real benefit to nuclear weapons. I see why they want them. They don't have much capability now. They feel like we could come for them sometime, we, the rest of the world. They feel encircled and pressured by the rest of the world, and we play into that, right? And they've seen regime change in the past, right? They're afraid of regime change. What can a nuclear weapon buy them? It can protect them against the kind of regime change that we did impose on Iraq and we did not impose on North Korea. Right? They have a clear lesson that they draw. So they think nuclear weapons are valuable, right? But nuclear weapons have not been very useful on the offense, right? They're going to be outgunned in any nuclear interchange or nuclear exchange. And they don't have very many good targets for nuclear weapons if they wanted to fire nuclear weapons to achieve political goals, right? They might have millennialist end-of-world goals, right? That's one of those things that, depending on what you think your risk level is like, you would consider. What if they're just nuts, right? But history suggests that they're not just nuts. So one example of this is Iran is actually quite deterred right now. In 1987, the United States smashed up the Iranian Navy in an afternoon, right, during the Iran-Iraq War. And ever since then, they've changed their military operations and their military doctrine, right? They favor flash, not steak, right? Smoke, sizzle, not steak. I mixed my metaphors, right? So that suggests that even if they got a nuclear weapon, they might be deterrable, and it's just as they've been deterred at the conventional level, right? And from the US perspective, Iran is never going to be a peer competitor. Right? This is a country that has some resources, has some money, but it's not a country that's going to really threaten the United States directly. Right? So as you hold it in perspective, the United States might worry about China becoming a competitor like the Soviet Union, or not. Right? That's a concern because that's a country with the resources and the size and the power to really compete with the United States. Iran is not that country. And that just, I think, is a helpful perspective. So look, we don't get to choose what Iran builds for their arsenal. We can slow them down. We can make it hard for them. We can say, look, we don't want you to have a bomb. We would prefer that you didn't. But we don't get to pick whether the Iranians think they want a bomb or not and how much effort the Iranians put into trying to get a bomb. Right? They pick that. So the real question for us is that we need to think, well, is it worth it to us to do a lot more, to take much riskier actions, to pick fights for the marginal benefit of reducing this thing that we don't want, right? And I think different people will differ on that, and I wish we could have a significant political discussion of that in the United States, right? There's incredible political consensus that doesn't think through these kinds of questions, right? It just says, we are opposed to Iran getting a nuclear bomb, ergo, our policy is very hawkish on Iran. Right? So that's the real question. So where does this leave? I promised I'd try to answer. What are the odds of peace? I actually think the odds of peace are pretty good. Right? I think we're likely to bumble along. Iran is slowly going to pursue a nuclear weapon. We're unlikely to have a deal because it's not in their interest, and whatever deal that would be in their interest is not in our interest. So just over time, they're going to move towards a nuclear weapon. And I don't think people are going to decide it's worth it to have a big fight to prevent them. And I think just because they have a bomb, after they get the bomb, that's not immediately going to cause an outbreak of war, right? We can learn to live with this just as we learn to live with Mao's bomb and Stalin's bomb and everybody else's bomb. And that's why I think it's not going to be pleasant, but it's going to be peaceful. So, thank you.
So many parts of the world have decidedly gone non-nuclear, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, New Zealand's not going that route. The Treaty of Tlatelolco from Mexico decided all of Latin America will not go nuclear.
Yeah.
Most of Africa can't afford to. It seems like all the endgame scenarios are in Asia, be it North Korea, Pakistan, Iran, Israel. But it does seem that one can turn the other direction, and there are examples of this having occurred in other parts of the world.
Yeah, so there are 2 countries that had nuclear weapons and gave them up, right? South Africa and Ukraine. People talk, well, so it's not, I guess, Kazakhstan also and Belarusia, but Ukraine was the relevant one. And it's very unusual behavior, and it depends on particular understanding of national interests and security interests, right? So, I mean, South Africa, the bomb program was always a little bit of a mystery to people. You know, the threat to the apartheid government of South Africa was not a threat you could respond to very well with nuclear weapons. So why were they doing this? And it turned out that after they got to the end and they decided we don't want to, fight it out to the last ditch effort, having a killing fields situation, they said we have no need for nuclear weapons. They got rid of them, right? Iran is a very different situation, right? Iran is not in a position where they think about these things and they think, from our national security interests, we have no use for a nuclear weapon, right? South Africa was not faced with conquest, regime change in the way that, through the mechanism that Iran is faced with, right? So the different situation, I think, is what leads to a different attitude towards nuclear weapons in Iran, and why I understand why they would want a nuclear weapon. Maybe that situation will change. Like, people do decide, at one time, Brazil and Argentina both had not very serious nuclear programs, right? Neither country was heavily committed to this. They dabbled, right? And it petered out. They said, it's not worth it. And they both quit. So that can happen. Well, yeah, but nobody else had a program, right?
The information that you shared with us, it's very valuable. And if it was available to you, such as we can live with nuclear Iran, that Iran is not really a threat, that Iran cannot win in a confrontation, that they're only enriching up to 20%, and their facilities are inferior and they have problems with them. If all that information is available to you, don't we assume that it's available to the Israeli and American intelligence? And why are they over-exaggerating the threat of Iran? Is there something political behind this? I'm a peace advocate. I'm anti-war, anti-violence, anti-weapons of any sort, anti-nuclear weapons, whether it's Iran, whether it's Pakistan, India, Israel, the United States. We should abolish all those things just to seek peace. But why are they over-exaggerating the threat?
Well, so we could have a conversation about abolishing weapons another time. I'll try to stay specifically on the exaggeration of the threat. So I'm not sure that there's a willful exaggeration of the threat by most people. Like, it's kind of how you interpret enriching to 20%, right? So enriching to 20% is legal if you do it right. They don't. But it's plausible from the perspective of we have a non-bomb reason to do it. I mean, that's why the 20% is significant. But what people are afraid of is that 20% gives you the capability to go way beyond, to go to 93%, to go to bombs, right? And so that is a scary thing if you're scared. If you're scared just by the existence of an Iranian nuclear weapon, right? Then 20%, it's not they have a bomb today, but it's that they're close and they know how they could get to a bomb if they wanted to, right? And there are lots of countries in the world that, are close like that we feel better about than we would feel about Iran being close like that. That's why people are nervous, right? Iran says they're hostile to us and we believe them. Right? That's why we don't want them to have this capability.
In Iran, there are 2 clocks ticking. One is the nuclear clock. The other one is democracy clock. everybody was hoping that the democracy clock will go faster than the threats of war, or even actual war, or sanctions that would hurt people. We're actually slowing the democracy clock faster, more than the clock of the nuclear. The nations, maybe you can deter a government. It's very hard to deter a nation. If a nation, collective psyche of a nation, throughout history, as you mentioned, 1953, here it sounds like a distant past.
Right.
In Iran, even Ottoman war is still in fresh memory. People remember Russia taking all the northern territories, Ottomans taking part of the eastern Turkey, invasion of Russia, England during the Second World War. Finally, most importantly, Iraq war, where German companies were supplying the chemical weapons. French planes were bombing them, and they were getting satellite data from US, and nobody cared that Iranians are getting gassed. It was accepted fact. So it gets into the psyche of people, and unfortunately, even though the government in Iran is completely despised by people, at every aspect, the social aspect, the economy, they might both have only one thing in common, and that's the quest for nuclear bomb. And it's for different reasons. For the people, it's in their collective psyche because of the history for the past 200 years, constantly getting raped and attacked by outside without any help. And for the government, for different reasons, to have a local hegemony and see itself in par with Israel. Right. So for these, I was asking your comment. One is effect of war and sanctions on the democracy process. Because if sanctions would work, North Korea and Cuba would be heaven of democracy by now. And also,
so sanctions are, it's very hard to use sanctions to get people to make really big changes, right? It doesn't happen very much. There are a couple of examples. Sanctions tend to work over small issues like enforcement of agreements to lower tariffs, right? You can get people to change their economic policy through sanctions. That is much more successful in those kinds of cases. So, the expectation that this is going to cause a big change in Iranian behavior going against their national interests, I don't think it's a reasonable expectation. That's why I think the denial aspect is much more important than the punishment aspect, right? Denying them access to specific technologies or making it hard is a more effective sanctioning technique than just inflicting economic pain. It's not clear, again, Iranian politics are especially opaque, but politics in every country is opaque. So I mentioned this to someone earlier, like Mitt Romney thought he was going to win the election here, right? He knew American political culture. He had 1 million polls. He had a strategy. He had lots of advisors helping him understand what was going to happen. And he was totally wrong. It wasn't a close election. He lost, right? So the idea that we can understand and pick the effects of our sanctions policy on specific political groups, who's going to be up, who's going to be down, in another country that we don't understand that well, I think that's just, you're tricking yourself. Like you can tell yourself a story, but you have no reason to believe that story is going to be any more likely to be right than a different story you could tell yourself. So I have no idea whether it's going to cause democracy one way or the other, right? Particularly if the people blame the current regime for the sanctions, then they'd be more likely to throw the bastards out, right? If they blame us for the sanctions, then they're more likely to support the bastards who say we don't like them, right? And so I don't know which one is going to happen, and I don't know how to convince them to go our way, not the other way, right? So I can't give you a sharp answer to say, look, we should lay off the sanctions because it'll help democracy. I also am quite concerned, particularly based on your second comment, that democracy wouldn't actually solve the problem of Iranian nuclear weapons. Like, they could have a democratic election, they'd all vote, and the people would say, this is great, let's spend a lot of money on nuclear weapons, right? And I actually think that's a likely outcome to the extent that I understand much, and I don't think I understand that much, so I might be wrong, right? But, I think you're right, that people have good reason to think they want the prestige and the defense value of nuclear weapons in Iran. It's not just the crazy leaders.